The wind had been blowing for 3 days without pause, a low and hollow moan that scraped against the walls of the homestead until the wood seemed to vibrate with it. It was a dry wind, carrying the grit of the high plains, stripping the moisture from the earth and the hope from the soul. The sky above the territory was a flat, bruised gray, hanging low enough to touch the tops of the scrub oaks that lined the dry creek bed. Lila Cartwright stood in the center of her kitchen, her hands gripping the back of a rough-hewn chair until her knuckles turned the color of old parchment. She was 20 years old, though the mirror told a story of a woman 10 years her senior. The harsh sun and the relentless worry of the last 3 years had etched fine lines at the corners of her eyes, and her frame was thin, whittled down by work and fear. She was listening. Outside, beyond the rattling window pane, the sound of hoofbeats had ceased. There was the heavy thud of boots hitting the packed earth, then the scrape of a spur dragging on the porch steps. Lila took a breath, holding it in her chest like a shield. She smoothed the front of her apron, though her fingers trembled so violently she could barely feel the fabric. The door swung open, hitting the interior wall with a violence that made the plates on the dresser jump. Thomas Cartwright filled the frame. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, with a face that might have been handsome once, before the whiskey and the bitterness bloated it. He wore the dust of the trail like a second skin. His eyes were red-rimmed, glassy with drink, and dark with a foul temper that had been brewing in the saloons of Redford all afternoon. He did not speak at first. He merely stood there, swaying slightly, breathing in the scent of the house. It smelled of stale coffee and the lye soap Lila used to scrub the floors on her hands and knees. "Supper is ready." "Thomas," Lila said, her voice small, trying to occupy as little space as possible. "I made the stew you like." Thomas kicked the door shut behind him. The slam echoed in the small room, sealing them in together. He walked to the table, his boots heavy on the floorboards, and looked down at the pot. He did not sit. He turned his gaze to her, and Lila felt the familiar cold slide of dread in her gut. "I am not hungry," he said. His words were slurred, thick with the cheap rye whiskey sold at the edge of town. Lila nodded quickly. Stepping back, "I can keep it warm. For later." Thomas laughed, a sharp, barking sound devoid of humor. "Later. You are always talking about later, Lila. Like there is something better coming down the road." He moved toward her, and she forced herself to stand her ground, knowing that retreating only made him faster, crueler. He stopped inches from her, the smell of sweat and alcohol rolling off him in waves. He reached out and took her chin in his hand, his fingers hard and calloused. He squeezed until she winced, but she did not look away. To look away was an insult. To look him in the eye was a challenge. There was no winning. "They were laughing at me in town," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a growl. "Do you know that? Laughing at Thomas Cartwright?" Lila swallowed, her throat dry. Why would they laugh? "Thomas?" "Because of you!" he roared, the sudden volume making her flinch. He shoved her backward. She stumbled, her hip catching the edge of the table. But she stayed upright, "because I married a girl from the gutter with nothing to her name, and she walks around town like a frightened rabbit. They say I cannot control my own house. They say I went soft. I have done everything you asked," Lila whispered. "Everything?" He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. "You have done nothing. You are a burden. Lila, a mouth to feed, a waste of good land. I should have left you where I found you, starving in that shack with your drunkard father." He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip bruising, fingers digging into the old yellow-purple marks left from the last time he had lost his temper. He slammed her back against the rough log wall. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, and her head cracked against the wood. Stars danced in her vision, bright and dizzying. "I ought to sell you," Thomas hissed, leaning close, his face inches from hers. Spittle flew from his lips. "There are men at the railhead who pay good money for women. Maybe that is where you belong. Not here, not in a decent man's house." The threat hung in the air, terrified and real. Lila knew he was capable of it. She saw the cruelty in his eyes, a deep, bottomless pit where his soul should have been. Fear spiked in her chest, sharp and hot. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. It was a hard, cold knot of anger she had buried deep for 3 years. It was the part of her that remembered being a child who looked at the sky and dreamed of something other than pain. She pushed at his chest. "Let me go." "Thomas." He looked surprised for a heartbeat, and then his expression twisted into rage. "You think you can give me orders?" He threw her to the floor. Lila landed hard on her side, the rough floorboards scraping her skin. She gasped, trying to scramble away, but he was fast for a big man. He kicked the chair beside her, sending it clattering across the room, and then he turned toward the stone mantelpiece. Lila froze. Resting on the mantel, beside the oil lamp, was his Colt revolver. It was heavy, dark iron, always loaded. Thomas reached for it, his hands shaking with rage. "I am going to teach you a lesson," he muttered, his back to her. "A lesson you will not forget." The world narrowed down to that gun. Lila heard the ringing in her ears, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the wind. She smelled the kerosene from the lamp, sharp and chemical. She saw the dust motes dancing in the dim light. She knew, with a sudden, crystal clarity, that if he turned around with that gun, she would not live to see the sun rise over the prairie. Panic surged, electric and blinding. Lila did not think. She moved. She scrambled up from the floor, her boots slipping on the wood, and lunged for the mantel. Thomas saw her coming. He roared, grabbing for the weapon, but Lila's hand closed around the cold walnut grip a fraction of a second before his. She pulled it down, the weight of it shocking in her small hand. Thomas slammed his body against hers, pinning her to the wall, his hands clamped around her wrists, crushing bone together. He was shouting something, vile and incoherent, his breath hot and sour against her face. He was too strong. He was pushing her arm up, trying to wrench the gun free. Lila looked into his eyes and saw her death. It was right there, waiting. "No!" she gasped. She twisted her body, using the leverage of the wall, and fought against his grip with every ounce of strength she possessed. The gun lowered, the barrel turning between them. His weight crushed the air from her chest. Her finger found the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the cramped room. It was not just a sound. It was a physical blow that shook the very air. Thomas jerked violently. His grip on her wrists vanished instantly. He took a staggering step back, his eyes going wide, the rage replaced by a sudden, childlike confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. He collapsed forward, catching himself on the table before sliding down to the floor. He rolled onto his back, staring up at the ceiling beams. A dark stain began to spread across the front of his shirt, blooming like a terrible red flower. Lila stood pressed against the wall, the gun still held in both hands, the barrel smoking. The smell of gunpowder filled the room, acrid and sulphurous, mixing immediately with the heavy, metallic scent of blood. For a few seconds, there was no sound but the wind rattling the frame of the house and the harsh rasp of Thomas's breathing. Lila lowered the gun slowly, her entire body shaking. She took a step toward him. "Thomas," she whispered. His chest hitched once, then twice. His eyes, fixed on a point somewhere above him, began to glaze over. The rise and fall of his ribs slowed, paused, and then stopped. He was dead. The silence that followed was heavier than the wind. It wrapped around Lila like a shroud, suffocating and cold. She stared at the man who had been her husband, the man who had owned her life for 3 years. He looked smaller now, just a heap of clothes and flesh on the floor. The reality of it hit her like a hammer. She had killed him. She was a wife who had killed her husband. In the territory, there was no word for that other than murder. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She dropped the gun. It hit the floor with a heavy thud that made her jump. She backed away, her hands coming up to cover her mouth, suppressing a scream that clawed at her throat. "I have to go," she whispered to the empty room. She could not stay here with him. She could not wait for his brother Clayton to come riding up the drive. She staggered to the door, grabbing a rough wool shawl from the hook as she passed. She paused, looking back at the gun on the floor. "Take it," a voice in her head whispered. She scrambled back, snatched the revolver from the blood-spattered floorboards, and shoved it into the pocket of her dress. She ran out of the house, leaving the door wide open to the wind. Her horse, a mare named Bess, was tied to the rail, tossing her head nervously at the smell of powder and death. Lila untied the reins with fumbling fingers. She mounted awkwardly, her skirts bunching around her legs, and kicked the mare into a gallop. The cold air hit her flushed face like a slap. She tasted dust and iron on her tongue. She did not look back at the homestead. Crouched alone and dark against the horizon, she rode north, toward the only place where there was law, toward the town of Redford. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Terror and a strange, terrifying freedom warring within her. Redford was a town carved out of stubbornness and mud. It sat on the edge of the territory, a collection of timber buildings huddled together against the vastness of the plains. There was a single main street, churned into deep ruts by wagon wheels and horse hooves. It boasted a livery stable that smelled of wet hay, a general store with dusty windows, a church with a leaning steeple, and a saloon that never seemed to close. At the far end of the street, sitting slightly apart as if in judgment of the rest, was the sheriff's office. Sheriff Jacob Harlow stepped out onto the boardwalk, pulling the collar of his coat up against the biting wind. He was a man of 40 years, with the lean, hard look of someone who had survived a war and then spent a decade trying to forget it. His face was lined by sun and sorrow, his eyes a pale, piercing blue that seemed to see more than people wanted them to. He moved with a deliberate slowness, the ease of a man who knew he could move fast when he had to. He looked up at the sky, studying the bruised clouds rolling in from the west. "Storm is breaking tonight, Sam," Jake said quietly. His deputy, a young man named Sam Miller, who still had the softness of youth in his cheeks, leaned in the doorway behind him. "Reckon so. Sheriff, the creek is already rising." Jake nodded, reaching into his vest pocket for a pouch of tobacco. It was quiet in town. The saloon was humming with low conversation, but the street was mostly empty. A few ranch hands were loading supplies at the store, and Mrs. Gable was hurrying her children home before the rain started. It was the kind of evening Jake liked. Quiet, manageable. He was just rolling a cigarette when he heard the horse. It wasn't the rhythmic trot of a casual rider. It was the frantic, uneven gallop of an animal being pushed too hard. Jake paused, the unlit cigarette in his hand, and looked down the street. A rider appeared at the edge of town, a dark shape against the gray sky. As the horse drew closer, Jake straightened up, his eyes narrowing. It was a woman. She was riding astride, her dress hiked up, her hair a tangled mess of brown blown wild by the wind. She was gripping the reins so hard her hands were white. But it was the dark stains on her blue dress that made Jake step off the boardwalk and into the street. The town seemed to freeze. The men loading the wagon stopped, crates in their hands. A woman drawing water from the public well paused, the bucket halfway up. The silence of the street deepened, heavy with sudden tension. Lila Cartwright rode into the center of town and pulled hard on the reins. The mare danced sideways, foam flecking its mouth. Lila looked wild, her chest heaving, her eyes wide and staring at nothing. Jake approached her calmly, his movements slow and predictable. He kept his right hand near his hip, not touching his gun, but ready. He saw the way she looked at the people on the boardwalk, like a trapped animal looking for a gap in the fence. "Easy now," Jake said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the wind. "Hold her steady." He reached out and took the bridle, his hand firm on the leather. The horse settled at his touch. Jake looked up at the woman. Her face was pale, streaked with dust and tears. There was a smear of blood on her cheek. "Ma'am?" Jake said gently. Lila looked down at him. For a moment, she didn't seem to see him. Then her eyes focused on the silver star pinned to his coat. She let out a sound that was half sob, half-gasp. I need help," she stammered. "Let me help you down," Jake said. He reached up. Lila let go of the saddle horn and practically fell into his arms. She was light, too light, trembling so hard her teeth chattered. Jake caught her, holding her steady until her boots found the dirt. She clung to his coat, her fingers digging into the wool. Jake looked over her shoulder at the gathering crowd. He saw the whispers starting, the fingers pointing at the blood on her dress. "What happened?" Jake asked, keeping his voice low. For her ears only. "Are you hurt?" Lila shook her head violently. No, it's not my blood." She pulled back slightly, looking up at him with eyes that were haunted by something terrible. "I shot him," she whispered. Her voice cracked. "I shot Thomas." Jake froze. The name hung in the air between them. Thomas Cartwright. One of the biggest ranchers in the county. A man with money, land, and a family that held a lot of sway in these parts. "You shot Thomas Cartwright?" Jake repeated, his tone carefully neutral. "He was going to kill me," Lila said, her voice rising in hysteria. "He had the gun. I didn't mean to. Is he dead? Oh, God, tell me he isn't dead." Jake looked at the blood soaking the front of her dress. It was a lot of blood. He knew, with the instinct of a man who had seen too many battlefields, that Thomas Cartwright was likely not breathing. "Sam," Jake called out without looking away from Lila. The deputy was at his side in an instant. "Yes, Sheriff. Get the folks back. Clear the street. Take her horse to the livery." Sam nodded, eyes wide as he looked at Lila, but he moved to obey. "All right, folks. Show's over. Move along now." Jake turned his attention back to Lila. "Ma'am, you need to come with me. Now." He took her arm, his grip firm but not cruel, and guided her toward the office. Lila stumbled, her legs refusing to work properly. She felt numb, as if she were walking through deep water. The town was a blur of faces, curious, judging, frightened. She heard snippets of words. Cartwright, shot, blood. Jake opened the door and ushered her inside, shutting it firmly against the prying eyes of the town. The office was warm, smelling of wood smoke and pipe tobacco. There was a desk, a potbelly stove, a rack of rifles, and a heavy iron door leading to the cells in the back. "Sit down," Jake said, pulling a wooden chair away from the wall. Lila collapsed into it. She put her hands on her knees and stared at them. They were stained red. Jake walked to his desk and leaned against it, studying her. He saw things the townspeople hadn't. He saw the fresh bruise blooming on her jawline. He saw the way she held her left arm close to her body, as if her ribs were sore. He saw the old, yellowing mark on her wrist, where a hand had grabbed her too hard, days or weeks ago, and he saw the scar on her lip, a thin white line that spoke of a split lip that had healed badly. He felt a tightening in his chest, a familiar anger that he usually kept locked down tight. "You have a gun on you, ma'am?" he asked. Lila nodded slowly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the Colt. Her hand shook so much she almost dropped it. Jake took it from her gently. He checked the cylinder. 1 round fired, 5 remaining. He placed the gun on his desk. Out of her reach. "I have to arrest you," Jake said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Lila looked up. "Arrest me? You confessed to shooting a man," Jake said, "until I know exactly what happened out there. You are in my custody." He reached for the handcuffs hanging on the wall. He hesitated for a second, looking at her thin wrists, raw and red from the struggle. But the law was the law, and in a town like Redford, the law was the only thing keeping the chaos at bay. "Stand up, please." Lila stood. She held out her wrists obediently. The metal clicked shut, the sound loud in the quiet room. The cuffs were cold and heavy. Jake looked her in the eye. "Tell me exactly what happened." Lila looked at the floor. "He came home drunk. He was angry. He said he was going to sell me. He threw me down. He went for the gun." She looked up then, and Jake saw the raw, naked terror in her eyes. It wasn't the terror of a criminal caught in the act. It was the terror of a prey animal that had turned to bite. He was going to kill me. "Sheriff," she whispered. "I know it. I saw it in his eyes." Jake believed her. He shouldn't have. He was a lawman, and evidence was what mattered, not feelings. But he looked at the bruises on her neck, and he believed her. "I need to put you in the cell," Jake said softly. He led her to the back. The jail area was small, built of stone and iron. There were 2 cells. He opened the one on the left. It had a narrow cot with a thin mattress and a bucket in the corner. Lila walked in. She didn't fight. She sat on the edge of the cot and pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them despite the cuffs. Jake locked the door. The heavy clank of the bolt sliding home seemed to echo endlessly. As he turned back to the office, a flash of lightning illuminated the room, turning the shadows stark and black. Thunder rolled over the town, shaking the floorboards. The storm had arrived. Jake sat at his desk, but he didn't work. He stared at the gun on the blotter. Thomas Cartwright's gun. He thought about the Cartwright family. Clayton Cartwright would be here by morning, demanding blood. The town would want a hanging. They didn't like women who killed their husbands, no matter the reason. It upset the natural order of things. From the back room, he heard a sound. It was a soft, jagged sobbing. Jake closed his eyes. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the grit of the day on his skin. He remembered his own wife, Sarah, dead 5 years now of a fever he couldn't fight. He remembered the promise he made when he pinned on the star. To be fair, to protect, but who was he protecting tonight? The dead man on the floor of a cabin, or the shivering girl in the cage? The sobbing went on, broken and hopeless. It tore at something inside him. Jake stood up. He walked to the stove and poured a cup of coffee from the pot that was always hot. He found a rough wool blanket in the supply chest. He walked back to the cell. Lila was curled in the corner, her face buried in her knees. "Ma'am," Jake said. She looked up, startled. Her eyes were red and swollen. "Here," he said. "It's cold tonight." He unlocked the cell door just enough to slide the blanket and the cup inside. Lila moved forward hesitantly. She reached for the cup. Her fingers brushed his. Her skin was ice cold. His was warm. The contact lasted only a second, but it sent a jolt through Jake that he hadn't expected. It wasn't just pity. It was a fierce, sudden desire to stand between her and the world. It was a recognition of shared brokenness. Lila looked at him, her eyes wide, holding the warm cup with both hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake looked at her, really looked at her, in the dim light of the lantern. He saw the strength beneath the fear. He saw a woman who had survived hell and was now apologizing for it. "Try to sleep," Jake said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I'll be right here." He locked the door again and went back to his desk. The wind howled outside, lashing rain against the walls of the jail, trying to get in. But Jake sat there, watching the door to the cell, his hand resting near his gun. He knew, with a sinking certainty that terrified him more than any gunfight, that his life had just changed irrevocably. He was a sheriff, and she was a killer. But as the rain hammered down on the roof of the jail, Jake Harlow knew he was already falling in love with the woman in the iron cage. The storm that had raged through the night broke just before dawn, leaving the town of Redford scrubbed clean and raw under a pale, shivering sky. The sun crawled up over the eastern ridge, casting long, bruised shadows across the mud of the main street. It was the kind of morning that should have been quiet, but the town was already awake, buzzing with a nervous, electric energy. Men stood in tight knots on the boardwalks, their breath steaming in the cold air, boots scraping against the damp wood. They spoke in low voices, eyes darting toward the sheriff's office at the end of the street. The women, gathering at the communal well with their wooden buckets, whispered behind their hands, their face grave and eager. The news had traveled faster than the wind. Lila Cartwright had shot her husband. Thomas Cartwright was dead. The sentence seemed to hang in the air, impossible and heavy. He was a man who cast a long shadow, a man who owned half the valley, A man who sat in the front pew on Sundays, and he had been killed by the quiet, waif-like girl he had brought home from the city 3 years ago. Sheriff Jake Harlow stood inside the office, looking out through the dusty window pane. He could feel the eyes of the town on the building. They were waiting for a show. They were waiting for justice, or at least what passed for it in the territory. He turned to his deputy. Sam Miller was sitting on the edge of the desk, looking pale and young. He was twisting his hat in his hands. "Sam, I need you to ride out to the Cartwright place," Jake said, his voice steady, cutting through the younger man's nerves. "Take 2 men with you. Good men. Take Old Man Miller and maybe Jim from the livery, not anyone who owes the Cartwrights money." Sam nodded, standing up. "You want us to bring him in? I want you to bring the body in." "Yes," Jake said, "but before you touch a thing, I want you to look, Sheriff?" Jake walked over to him, his blue eyes hard and serious. "I want you to look at the floor. See if there are scuff marks. Look at the furniture. Is it overturned? Is there broken glass? Write it down. Sam, draw a picture if you have to, and look for the gun. I have the one she used here, but see if there is another one. See where it is lying." He paused, letting the weight of the order sink in. "If anyone asks, you are just doing your job, but I want to know if a man was standing or fighting when he died. Do you understand me?" "I understand," Sam said, straightening his spine. He sensed, perhaps for the first time, that the truth of what happened in that cabin was more important than the fact that a man was dead. "Go on. Then, and Sam, treat the body with respect. He still has family." When Sam left, the office fell silent. Jake looked toward the heavy iron door that led to the cells. He had not slept, and he doubted the prisoner had either. He took the keys from his belt and unlocked the door, the metal groaning in the quiet. Lila was sitting exactly where he had left her. She was wrapped in the wool blanket, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring at the stone wall opposite the cot. She did not look up when he entered. She looked smaller in the daylight, her face washed out and gray, her eyes dark hollows of exhaustion. Her hands, resting on the blanket, were trembling, a fine, rhythmic tremor that shook her whole frame. "Ma'am," Jake said softly. Lila flinched, her head snapping toward him. For a moment, her eyes were wild, unseeing, still trapped in the cabin with the sound of the gunshot. Then she focused on him, and her shoulders slumped. "Sheriff," she whispered. "I have some water heated," Jake said, "and a basin. There is a small room in the back here, used for storage. It has a lock on the inside. I thought you might want to wash up." Lila looked down at her dress. The blood had dried to a stiff, dark rust color. It covered her front, her sleeves, her hands. She stared at it with a detached horror, as if realizing for the first time that she was wearing the evidence of a life ended. "Yes," she said, her voice cracking. "Please." Jake led her to the small back room. He set a basin of steaming water on a crate, along with a bar of rough yellow soap and a clean rag. He placed a chair for her. "I will be right outside the door," Jake said. "Take your time." He stepped out and closed the door, leaning his back against the frame. He crossed his arms over his chest, listening. He heard the rustle of fabric, the splash of water, the clink of the tin cup against the basin. Inside the small room, Lila scrubbed at her skin until it burned. She washed the blood from her fingers, watching the water turn a pale, sickly pink. She stripped off the ruined dress, shivering in the cold air, and caught sight of herself in the small, warped shaving mirror hanging on a nail. She stopped. The bruises were blooming across her skin like storm clouds. There were dark purple marks on her upper arms where Thomas had grabbed her, a fresh, angry welt on her ribs, a cut on her lip, and older marks, yellow and green fading shadows on her shoulders and back. She touched the bruise on her neck, tracing the shape of a thumb. Shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. She had hidden these marks for years. She had worn high collars and long sleeves even in the heat of summer. She had lied to the neighbors. She had lied to herself. But as she looked at the map of pain written on her body, a strange, cold relief settled in her chest alongside the shame. He did this. she whispered to the mirror. There was no hiding it now. If they hanged her, they would hang a woman who was already broken. If they looked at her, really looked at her, they would have to see what Thomas Cartwright was. The secret was out. The monster was dead, but he had left his signature all over her. Outside the door. Jake closed his eyes. He could hear her breathing, ragged, hitching breaths that sounded like she was fighting for air. He fought the urge to open the door, to check on her. He wanted to give her dignity, the only thing he could offer her now. But his mind kept drifting back to the glimpse of her wrists he had seen when he put the cuffs on her, the raw, red skin, the old scars. He felt a protective surge that had no place in a sheriff's heart. He felt guilty for it. He was supposed to be the law, impartial and cold. But he stood guard outside that door not like a jailer, but like a sentry protecting something precious. It was past noon when the wagon returned. The wheels creaked loudly in the silence of the street. Sam sat on the bench, his face grim. Behind him, under a heavy canvas tarp, lay the body of Thomas Cartwright. Two men rode behind the wagon, their hats pulled low. Jake stepped out to meet them. The townspeople pressed forward, a silent, morbid tide. But Jake held up a hand, stopping them at the edge of the boardwalk. "Take him to the undertaker," Jake said quietly to Sam. "Then bring your report to my desk." He did not lift the tarp. He did not need to see Thomas again. He needed to see where Thomas had died. Jake saddled his horse, a roan gelding named Rusty, and rode out of town. The wind had picked up again, cutting across the open prairie with a knife's edge. The land here was unforgiving. It was a wide, brown ocean of grass and dust, broken only by the occasional ravine or cluster of cottonwoods. The Cartwright homestead sat alone on a rise, miles from the nearest neighbor. It was a bleak place. The fences leaned under the weight of the relentless wind. The barn needed paint. There were no flowers, no garden, nothing to suggest softness or care. It was a working ranch, stripped to the bone. Jake tied his horse to the rail and walked up the steps. The door was still open, banging softly against the frame in the breeze. He stepped inside. The air in the cabin was cold and still smelled of metallic blood and the sulfur tang of burnt powder. Jake stood in the doorway, taking it in. He saw the chair on its side, skidded across the floor as if kicked. He saw the scuff marks on the wood where heels had dragged. He saw the table shoved askew, and he saw the blood, a dark pool on the floorboards, already tacky and drying. Jake walked through the room slowly, careful where he stepped. He crouched down near the wall. There was a dent in the plaster, right at the height of a woman's head. He touched it, fresh. He looked at the mantelpiece, a spot in the dust where a gun had rested. He moved to the kitchen area. On the floor, swept into a corner but still visible, were the shards of a broken plate. Not from yesterday. Old shards, and a hole in the wall that looked like it had been made by a fist. Jake took out his notebook and a pencil. He began to sketch the room. He marked the position of the chair, the blood, the dent in the wall. This was not a murder in cold blood. A blind man could see that. This was a fight, a desperate, terrified struggle in a room that was too small for the violence it held. He stood up, looking around the bleak cabin. He imagined Lila here, day after day, alone in this wind-battered box with a man who put his fist through walls. He imagined the silence of the prairie pressing in on her, with no one to hear her scream, and anger, cold and hard, settled in his gut. He swallowed it down. He was a lawman. He dealt in facts, and the facts were telling him that Lila Cartwright had been fighting for her life long before she pulled that trigger. By the time Jake returned to town, the sun was sinking low, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. There were horses tied outside the sheriff's office, expensive horses with silver-studded tack. Jake dismounted and walked in. The office felt crowded. Clayton Cartwright stood by the stove, warming his hands. He was a tall man, older than Thomas had been, with the same broad shoulders but none of the softness. His face was like a cliffside, hard, weathered, and unyielding. He wore a black frock coat that cost more than Jake made in a year. Two younger men, cousins likely, stood by the window, their hands resting on their gun belts. "Sheriff," Clayton said. He did not turn around immediately. His voice was low, rolling like distant thunder. "Mr. Cartwright," Jake replied, hanging his hat on the peg. "I am sorry for your loss." Clayton turned then. His eyes were the color of slate, and just as cold. "My brother is dead. Harlow, shot down in his own home by that woman." He spat the word woman as if it were a curse. "I saw the body," Clayton continued. "One shot, straight to the heart. She didn't miss. She is in custody," Jake said, moving behind his desk. He wanted the physical barrier between them. "I want to see her." Clayton said, "No." Jake said. The room went very quiet. The two cousins shifted, their spurs chiming softly. "Excuse me?" Clayton said, stepping forward. "She is a prisoner in my jail," Jake said, his voice level. "She has been charged. She will stand trial. Until then, no one sees her but me and my deputy. She is a murderess," Clayton said, his voice rising. "She married my brother for his money. She waited until he was drunk, and she put a bullet in him to take the ranch. We all knew she was trash. We warned him. That is for a judge to decide." Jake said, "The judge is weeks away." Clayton snapped. He leaned his hands on Jake's desk, looming over him. "We don't need a judge to tell us what a killer looks like. We handle our own out here. Harlow, you know that." Jake rested his hand on the desk, inches from his own revolver. "I know how things used to be. Clayton, but this is a town with the laws. And as long as I am wearing this badge, Lila Cartwright stays in that cell until a circuit judge sits in that chair." Clayton stared at him. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Jake held the gaze. Refusing to blink, he felt the weight of the Cartwright power pressing down on him. The money, the cattle, the men they commanded. Clayton smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You are making a mistake. Jake, defending a woman like that, it makes a man look weak. It makes people wonder where his loyalties lie." "My loyalty is to the law," Jake said. Clayton straightened up. He brushed an invisible speck of dust from his coat. "We will see," he said softly. "We will see." He turned and walked out, his cousins trailing behind him like wolves. The door shut, but the threat remained in the room, lingering like the smell of ozone before a lightning strike. The days turned into a week, then two. The town of Redford settled into a tense, simmering waiting game. Word had come that the territorial judge, a man named Judge Blackwood, was on a circuit and wouldn't reach Redford for another 3 weeks. For Lila, time became a blur of gray stone and iron bars. The world had shrunk to the size of her cell. She could hear the town outside. She heard the rumble of wagons, the shouts of children, and sometimes, late at night, the angry voices of men in the street. She heard the word hanging more than once. But inside the jail, there was a strange, quiet sanctuary. Jake was there every day. He stopped the townspeople from gathering at the window. He chased off the drunks who came to jeer, and he brought her food. Not the watery gruel that prisoners usually got, but plates from the hotel restaurant, beef stew with thick carrots, fresh biscuits, coffee with sugar in it. At first, Lila ate mechanically, keeping her eyes on the floor. She was waiting for the blow. She was waiting for the kindness to be a trick, but the blow never came. One evening, Jake pulled his chair up near the cells to eat his own supper. The office was dim, lit only by the golden glow of the oil lamp on his desk. Lila sat on the floor of her cell, holding a piece of bread. "Sheriff?" she asked. Her voice was rusty from disuse. Jake looked up. "Just Jake, ma'am. I think we are past titles." Lila hesitated. "Jake, what will happen to the ranch? To Thomas's land?" Jake chewed slowly before answering. "Clayton is running it for now. The court will decide later. If things go well, it would technically be yours." Lila let out a short, bitter laugh. "Mine? I don't want it. I never wanted it." She looked at him through the bars. The shadows lay heavy across her face, making her look young and old all at once. My father owed Thomas $400, she said quietly. It wasn't a courtship, Jake, it was a transaction. Thomas saw me at the general store in Abilene. He told my father he would clear the debt if I came with him. Jake stopped eating. He sat very still. I was 17. Lila said. She was talking to the bread in her hands. I thought maybe he was a good man. He smiled at everyone in town. He bought candy for the children. He tipped his hat to the ladies. She looked up, her eyes wet. How can a man be two different people? How can he be so kind on the street and a devil in his own house? Jake felt a pain in his chest that had nothing to do with the law. He thought of the broken plate in the cabin, the dent in the wall. Some men are broken. Lila, he said softly, and they try to break everyone else so they don't feel so alone. Lila wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I tried to be good. I cooked, I cleaned, I never spoke back, but it was never enough. Jake stood up. He walked to the bars. He wanted to reach through to take her hand, but he held himself back. I went to the cabin. Lila, he said. She froze. I saw the room. I saw the chair he kicked over. I saw the marks on the wall. Lila looked at him, her breath hitching. I saw the struggle, Jake said firmly. I know you didn't just walk up and shoot him. I know you were fighting for your life. Tears spilled over her lashes, tracking through the dust on her cheeks. It was the first time anyone had said it, the first time anyone had acknowledged that she wasn't a monster, but a survivor. You believe me? She whispered. I believe you, Jake said, and I'm going to make sure the judge hears it too. He went back to his desk, sitting down heavily. He picked up his pen to write, but his hand hovered over the paper. He thought of his wife, Sarah. He thought of the fever that had taken her, the helpless rage he had felt as she slipped away. He had loved her with everything he had, and he realized, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, that he had been sleepwalking since the day she died. He had been a badge, a gun, a set of rules, but looking at Lila, seeing the fierce light in her eyes despite the darkness surrounding her, he felt awake, and it hurt. It hurt to care this much about a woman the law said he might have to hang. The nightmare came 3 nights later. The wind was howling again, a mournful sound that crept through the cracks in the stone. Jake was asleep on the cot in the front office, fully dressed, his gun belt hanging on the chair. A scream tore through the silence. It was a high, terrified sound, abruptly cut off. Jake was on his feet before his eyes were fully open. He drew his revolver and kicked open the door to the cell block, heart hammering against his ribs. Lila! The cell was dark. He grabbed the lantern from the wall and held it up. Lila was curled in the far corner of the cell. She was thrashing, her hands clawing at the air, fighting off an invisible attacker. No! She cried out, her voice raw. No, Thomas, please! Jake shoved the gun into his holster. He fumbled for the keys, his hands shaking. He unlocked the door and threw it open. Lila, wake up! It's a dream! He dropped to his knees beside her. She was sobbing now, great heaving gasps that shook her small frame. She was still lost in the memory, pressing herself into the cold stone to get away. Jake hesitated for only a second. He reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder. Lila, you are safe. You are here with me. At his touch, she flinched violently, but then she froze. She opened her eyes. They were wide, dilated with terror. She looked at him, not recognizing him for a heartbeat. Then, slowly, the reality of the jail cell filtered in. Jake? She whispered. I'm here, he said. His voice was a low rumble, steady and grounding. Lila looked at his hand on her shoulder. His grip was firm, warm, and heavy. It wasn't a hand that wanted to hurt. It was an anchor. She slumped forward, exhausted, without thinking. Jake shifted, allowing her to lean against him. She rested her forehead against his arm. She was shivering. I saw him, she murmured. I saw him standing there. He is gone. Jake said, he can never hurt you again. He could smell the soap she had used, a faint scent of lavender amidst the stone and dust. He could feel the heat of her body through her thin dress. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The boundaries between sheriff and prisoner, between man and woman, blurred in the dim lamplight. There was a closeness there, charged and dangerous. Jake knew he should pull away. He knew this could ruin him, but he didn't move. He kept his hand on her shoulder, his thumb sweeping back and forth in a slow, soothing rhythm. "You should go back to sleep," he said eventually, though he didn't want to leave. Lila lifted her head. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. In the shadows, the lines of worry on his face softened. "Stay?" she asked. "Just for a minute?" Jake nodded. "I'll stay." He sat on the stone floor beside her, his back against the bars, keeping watch while she slowly calmed down. He stayed until her breathing evened out, until the terror left her eyes, and in the silence, the bond between them grew tight and unbreakable. The next morning, the town was not quiet. Jake woke to the sound of shouting. He had fallen asleep in his chair in the office after leaving Lila's cell. He stood up, rubbing his stiff neck, and walked to the window. A crowd had gathered in the street. There were 30 or 40 men, mostly ranch hands from the Cartwright spread, but some townspeople too. They were angry. The alcohol from the night before was still fueling them, and Clayton's money had likely bought a lot of rounds. "Bring her out," someone shouted. "Justice for Thomas," yelled another. Jake checked his gun. He settled his hat on his head. He opened the door and stepped out onto the boardwalk. The noise dipped slightly, but didn't stop. "Go home," Jake shouted, his voice booming. "This is unlawful assembly. We want the killer," a man in the front row shouted. He was holding a length of rope. Jake's hand dropped to his holster. He didn't draw, but the threat was clear. He stood alone on the wooden planks, a single figure against the mob. "There will be no lynching in my town," Jake roared. "The next man who steps onto this boardwalk spends a week in the hole, or worse, from inside the cell." Lila heard the shouts. She pressed her back against the wall, her heart hammering in her throat. She knew what that sound meant. She knew they wanted to drag her out and hang her from the cottonwood tree by the river. But then she heard Jake's voice. It was strong, unyielding, angry. "Get back! I said get back!" She closed her eyes. He was out there. He was standing between her and the rope. He was risking his life for her. For the first time in her life, someone was fighting for her. Outside, the crowd wavered. They looked at Jake's eyes, cold and blue as glacier ice. They looked at the hand on the gun. They knew Jake Harlow. They knew he didn't make idle threats. Clayton Cartwright wasn't there. He was too smart for that, but his influence was waning in the face of cold steel. Slowly, the mob began to break up. Men muttered curses, spat in the dirt, and turned away. The energy dissipated, leaving only the dust swirling in the street. Jake watched them go until the last man had turned the corner. Only then did he let out a long breath. His hands were steady, but his heart was pounding. He turned and went back inside, locking the heavy door behind him. He walked to the cell block. Lila was standing at the bars, her hands gripping the iron. She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear and something else. Gratitude, awe, hope. "Are you all right?" Jake asked. Lila nodded. "You stopped them. I told you," Jake said simply. "I will make sure the truth is heard." He looked at her, and in that moment, the air between them crackled. They both knew that the stakes had just been raised. It wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a war, and they were in the trenches together. The town of Redford was tightening like a noose. In the days following the arrest, the atmosphere shifted from shock to a simmering, organized hostility. It was no longer just gossip at the well. It was a campaign. Clayton Cartwright moved through the town with the confidence of a man who owned the very dirt beneath his boots. He did not shout in the streets. He did not make public threats. Instead, he visited the back rooms of the businesses that kept Redford alive. He sat in the plush leather chair of Mayor Higgins's office, smoking a cigar that smelled of expensive tobacco and implied obligation. He leaned over the counter at the bank, speaking in low, serious tones with Mr. Abernathy about the stability of land values and the danger of setting precedents. "If a wife can shoot a man like Thomas and walk free," Clayton said, his voice smooth as oiled leather, "then no man is safe in his own home. Property rights mean nothing if there is no order. We must make an example. Mayor, for the good of the territory." Money changed hands, not in bags of gold passed in alleyways, but in the subtle erasing of debts, the promise of new contracts, and the sudden approval of loans that had been stalled for months. By midweek, the mood in the Golden Steer Saloon had turned ugly. Men who owed Clayton favors, or who simply feared his reach, began to talk loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Swift justice is what we need," a cattle drover named Bill declared, slamming his mug on the bar. "Why wait for some city judge to come down here and tell us how to handle our business? She killed him. That is the beginning and the end of it." Sheriff Jake Harlow stood at the far end of the bar, nursing a coffee that had gone cold. He kept his hat pulled low, but he heard every word. He watched the nods of agreement ripple through the room. He saw the way the bartender, a man Jake had known for 10 years, avoided his gaze. The realization settled in Jake's gut like a stone. The trial was being rigged before the judge even saddled his horse. The jury would be drawn from these men, or men like them, men whose livelihoods depended on the goodwill of the Cartwright family. Jake stepped out into the night air, the noise of the saloon fading behind him. He touched the badge pinned to his chest. It felt heavy, a piece of cold tin that suddenly seemed to weigh more than he could carry. He was trapped. He was sworn to uphold a law that was being bought and sold by the pound, and his only ally was a terrified woman locked in a cage. The next morning, Jake pinned a note to the door of the office. Back by noon. Deputy Miller in charge. He saddled his roan, rusty, and rode out of town, heading west away from the Cartwright spread. He needed ammunition, not bullets, but truth. His first stop was the Hensley homestead, a small, struggling patch of land 3 miles from where Thomas and Lila had lived. Mrs. Hensley was a widow, a woman carved from the same hard wood as the fence posts she maintained. She was hanging laundry on a line that snapped in the relentless wind when Jake rode up. She watched him approach with wary eyes, wiping her hands on her apron. "Morning, Sheriff," she said, not smiling. "Morning, Mrs. Hensley," Jake said, tipping his hat. "I need to ask you a few questions about your neighbors." "Mrs." Hensley looked toward the horizon, her mouth setting into a thin line. "I don't want no trouble with the Cartwrights. Sheriff, Clayton can make life very hard for a woman alone." "I know," Jake said gently, "but a woman's life is on the line. You knew Lila. You saw her, Mrs." Hensley sighed, the sound lost in the wind. She looked down at her rough, red hands. "I saw her. She admitted she would come over sometimes, asking to borrow a cup of sugar or a bit of thread. Silly things. Things she didn't really need. She just wanted to be out of that house. Did you ever see marks on her?" Jake asked. "Mrs." Hensley hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I saw bruises, on her arms mostly. Once on her face, though she tried to hide it with a shawl. She said she fell. She said a horse kicked her. But I have been married. Sheriff, I know the difference between a horse kick and a man's fist." "Did you ever say anything?" "To who? Mrs.?" Hensley snapped, her voice sharp with defensive shame. "To Thomas? He would have burned my barn down. To her, what could I say? Leave him? And go where? The prairie doesn't forgive a woman on her own." She looked up at Jake, her eyes wet. He was a devil when the drink took him. "Sheriff, I could hear him shouting sometimes, even from here. I would hear things breaking, and then silence. The silence was worse." Jake wrote it all down in his notebook, his handwriting cramped and precise. "Thank you, Mrs. Hensley." He rode on, the anger in his chest burning hotter. His next stop was a small cabin nestled in a grove of cottonwoods near the creek, closer to the reservation line. It belonged to Raina, a native woman who served as a midwife and healer for the families who couldn't afford, or didn't trust, the town doctor. Raina was grinding herbs in a stone bowl when Jake entered. She did not look surprised to see him. She gestured to a stool. "You come about the Cartwright girl," Raina stated. It was not a question. "I did," Jake said. Raina continued her work, the pestle grinding rhythmically against the mortar. I wondered when someone would ask, "What can you tell me?" Raina stopped. She looked at Jake with dark, unreadable eyes. 2 years ago, in the deep winter, she came to me. She walked 3 miles in the snow. She was bleeding. "Bleeding?" Jake asked, a cold feeling spreading through his limbs. "She lost the babe," Raina said simply. "She was 4 months along. She said she slipped on the ice, but when I examined her, I saw the boot mark on her stomach." Jake felt the blood drain from his face. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "A boot mark. She begged me not to tell," Raina continued softly. "She said Thomas wanted a son more than anything. She said if he knew he had killed it, he would kill her too. So we buried the little one out back, under the willow tree. And she went home and told him it just happened, that she was weak." The nausea rose in Jake's throat, bitter and acidic. He thought of the man he had seen lying on the floor of that cabin, and for the first time, he was glad Thomas Cartwright was dead. "Will you testify to that?" Jake asked, his voice rasping, "if it comes to trial." Raina looked at him for a long moment. A white court will not listen to an Indian woman. "Sheriff, you know this. They will listen if I make them," Jake said fiercely. "They will listen." That evening, the jail was quiet. The deputy had gone home, and the town was settling into an uneasy slumber. Jake sat on a stool outside Lila's cell. The lamp on the floor cast long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. Lila was sitting on her cot, her hands folded in her lap. She looked thinner, if that was possible. The stress was eating her away from the inside. "I went to see Mrs. Hensley today," Jake said quietly. "And Raina." Lila flinched. She looked up, her eyes wide and stricken. "You spoke to Raina?" Jake nodded. "She told me about the winter 2 years ago." Lila let out a small, choked sound and turned her face away, pressing her forehead against the cool iron bars. Shame radiated off her in waves. "I didn't want anyone to know," she whispered. "It was my fault. I shouldn't have argued with him. I should have been quiet." Jake stood up. He moved closer to the bars, his voice intense. "No, look at me, Lila." She slowly turned her head. "It was not your fault," Jake said firmly. "A man who kicks a pregnant woman is not a man. He is a monster. And what happened to you? It is not shame. It is proof." "Proof?" Lila asked, tears spilling over. "Proof that you survived," Jake said. "Proof that you endured more than any soldier I ever served with." Lila looked at him, searching his face for any sign of disgust. She found none. She saw only a fierce, burning compassion that made her heart ache. "I don't want them to know," she whispered. "The town, they will think I am weak. They will talk about my baby. They are already talking." "Lila," Jake said gently, "but they are telling lies. We need to tell the truth. When the judge comes, you need to tell him everything, about the beatings, about the threats, about the baby." Lila shook her head, panic rising in her chest. I can't stand up in front of all those men and say those things. They will look at me. They will judge me. They will judge you anyway," Jake said. "But if you speak, if you let them see the truth, maybe we can save you." He paused, then added, "I will be there. I will be right beside you. I will testify to everything I saw. I will put my reputation, my badge, my life on the line for you. You will not be alone." Lila looked at him, and the terror in her chest eased. Just a fraction. He was a solid rock in a shifting sea. "I brought you something," Jake said, changing the subject to give her a moment to breathe. He reached for a bundle on his desk and passed it through the bars. "Mrs. Gable at the church sent it over." He lied. It was actually a dress he had bought himself from the general store, asking the clerk to keep it quiet. But he didn't want Lila to feel indebted to him. Lila unfolded the fabric. It was a simple dress made of blue calico, clean and neatly pressed. It wasn't fancy, but it was whole. It didn't have blood on it. She held the fabric to her chest, the scent of fresh soap filling her nose. She wasn't used to kindness. Kindness usually came with a price tag attached. "Thank you," she whispered. She looked up, and their eyes met through the steel barrier. The air in the small cell block suddenly felt thick, charged with an electricity that made the hair on Jake's arm stand up. He wanted to reach out. He wanted to brush the tear from her cheek. He wanted to unlock the door and pull her into the safety of his arms and never let go. He raised his hand, his fingers hovering inches from the bars. Lila leaned forward slightly, her breath hitching. She wanted him to touch her. She wanted to feel that warmth again. But Jake stopped. He curled his fingers into a fist and lowered his hand. He was the sheriff. She was his prisoner. There were lines he could not cross. Not yet. "Good night, Lila," he said, his voice rough. "Good night, Jake," she replied softly. The restraint between them was more intimate than a touch. It was a promise of something that could be, if they both survived the storm that was coming. The storm broke 2 nights later, but it wasn't rain and wind. It was men and violence. It was 3 a.m. The moon was hidden behind heavy clouds, leaving the alley behind the jail in pitch blackness. Jake was asleep in the front office, dozing fitfully in his chair with his feet on the desk. At the back of the building, a glass pane shattered. The sound was sharp and shocking in the silence. It was followed immediately by the heavy thud of boots on the floorboards of the storage room. Lila woke with a gasp. She sat up in the darkness of her cell, her heart pounding. She heard the latch of the inner door rattle. "Jake!" she screamed. "Jake! In the office!" Jake was already moving. He hit the floor running, his gun drawn before he was fully upright. The door to the cell block burst open, but it wasn't Jake. It was a man with a bandana covering his face, holding a heavy, devastating shotgun. 2 others were behind him. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. They rushed the cell. "Get the keys!" one of them shouted. Lila scrambled back into the corner, pressing herself against the stone. These men weren't here to free her. She saw it in their eyes. They were here to silence her. Jake kicked the office door open, the lantern in the front room casting a long beam of light into the chaos. "Drop it!" Jake roared. The man with the shotgun spun around. Jake fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet took the man in the shoulder, spinning him around. The shotgun blasted into the ceiling, raining plaster down on them. The other 2 men didn't run. One of them lunged at the bars of Lila's cell. He reached through, his hand grabbing a fistful of her dress, yanking her forward. "Come here, you witch!" he snarled. Lila screamed. Clawing at his hand, he slammed her against the bars, her head cracking against the iron. He was trying to get a clear shot at her through the gaps. Jake didn't hesitate. He charged. He couldn't shoot. Lila was in the line of fire. He slammed the butt of his pistol into the back of the attacker's head. The man crumpled. The 3rd man, seeing the tide turn, bolted for the back window. "Let him go!" Jake yelled to the empty room, breathless. He stood over the 2 men on the floor. One was groaning, clutching his shoulder. The other was unconscious. Jake kicked the shotgun away into the corner. He turned to the cell. "Lila?" She was on the floor, holding her head. Blood was trickling from a cut on her forehead where she had hit the bars. She was shaking so hard her teeth rattled. Jake unlocked the door with fumbling fingers. He rushed in and dropped to his knees. "Let me see," he said, his voice trembling. "Let me see." He tilted her head back gently. The cut was shallow, but a bruise was already forming on her arm where the man had grabbed her. "I'm all right," Lila stammered. "I'm all right." Jake pulled back, looking at her. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. He realized, with a sick jolt, that he was terrified. He had faced cannon fire in the war. He had faced down gunmen in the street, but nothing had ever scared him like the sight of that gun pointed at her cell. "They tried to kill me," Lila whispered. Jake nodded grimly. "They tried to make it look like a jailbreak, like you were trying to escape and got shot." He stood up, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. He dragged the conscious man out of the cell block and handcuffed him to the stove in the front office. The unconscious one he dragged out next. He knew these men. They were drifters, hired hands who worked the seasonal roundup for the Cartwrights. "Clayton sent you, didn't he?" Jake demanded, leaning over the wounded man. The man spat blood on the floor. "Go to hell, Sheriff." By morning, the town was in an uproar. The story that circulated wasn't the truth. The story, twisted by Clayton's allies, was that Lila's accomplices had tried to break her out, and the sheriff had barely held them off. See, the whispers went, "She brings violence wherever she goes. Men don't go to that kind of trouble unless there is something to fear. She is dangerous." Jake heard the talk. He knew the truth was the opposite. They feared what she would say. They feared the midwife's testimony. They feared the bruises. The jail didn't feel safe anymore. The back window was boarded up, but the vulnerability remained. The cell was a cage, and cages were easy to shoot into. "I'm moving you," Jake told Lila that afternoon. "Moving me where?" Lila asked, fear sparking in her eyes. "To the county prison?" "No," Jake said. "That's what they want. You'd never make it there alive." He led her out of the cell, through the office, and into the small back room where she had washed that first day. He had cleared out the crates and set up the cot. It had no bars. It had a solid wooden door that opened into his office. "You will stay here," Jake said. "I will sleep at my desk, right on the other side of this wall. No one gets in here without going through me first." It was a breach of protocol. It was likely illegal. But Jake didn't care. That night, the new arrangement changed everything. There were no bars between them now, just a thin wall of pine boards. Jake sat at his desk. The lamp turned low. He could hear the rustle of Lila's blanket. He could hear her breathing. "Jake?" Her voice came through the wood, soft and close. "I'm here," he said. "Thank you for saving me." "Again, you don't need to thank me." Lila. Silence stretched for a moment, comfortable and heavy. "Tell me about before," Lila said. "Before the war. Before you were a sheriff." Jake leaned his head back against the wall, closing his eyes. "I grew up on a farm in Ohio. It was green, greener than anything out here. My mother used to bake apple pies that smelled like cinnamon and home. I don't remember my mother," Lila whispered back. "She died when I was 3. My father, he was a hard man. He taught me how to skin a rabbit and how to be quiet, mostly how to be quiet." "I'm sorry," Jake said. "It's all right. I used to hide in the hayloft. I would read torn pages of old newspapers the store owner gave me. I read about cities, about oceans. I always wanted to see the ocean. Maybe one day you will," Jake said. Lila laughed softly, a sad, brittle sound. "Prisoners don't go to the ocean. Jake, you aren't a prisoner tonight," Jake said firmly. "Tonight, you are just Lila, and I am just Jake. The intimacy of it. 2 voices in the dark, stripped of titles and pretense, was overpowering." They talked for hours. Jake told her about the ghosts of the war that still woke him up sweating. Lila told him about the first time Thomas hit her, over a burnt pan of biscuits, and how she had apologized to him for it. It was the unburdening of 2 souls that had been carrying too much weight for too long. Late in the night, the conversation slowed. The fatigue began to pull at them. "Jake," Lila said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Yeah, I have to tell you something bad. Tell me, I'm not sad he's dead." Jake waited. "I feel relief," she confessed. "Every morning when I wake up and realize he isn't there, I feel like I can breathe for the first time in 3 years. Does that make me a monster? That is my greatest fear. Jake, that I am wicked inside. That I don't deserve to live because I am glad he is gone." Jake sat up. He turned his chair so he was facing the wall, leaning close to the wood. "Lila, listen to me." He pressed his hand against the boards, as if he could push his strength through to her. "You are not a monster. You are a human being who is trapped in a living hell. Feeling relief that the pain has stopped doesn't make you wicked. It makes you sane. But I killed him." She wept softly. "You survived him," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "There is a difference, and you deserve to live. You deserve to see the ocean. You deserve to be loved by someone who treats you like you are precious, not like you are property." The silence on the other side of the wall was thick. "You deserve more than pain." "Lila," Jake whispered. "Do you hear me?" "I hear you," she whispered back. Jake stayed there, his hand against the wall, until he heard her breathing deepen into sleep. He stayed awake, watching the door, his heart aching with a fierce, terrifying love for the woman on the other side of the pine boards. He knew then that he would burn the whole town down if he had to, just to keep her safe. The arrival of Judge Ambrose Blackwood was heralded not by trumpets, but by the creaking of a black carriage wheel that needed grease and the weary snort of 4 dust-covered horses. He rode into Redford on a Tuesday afternoon, bringing with him a clerk, a bailiff, and the suffocating weight of the territorial law. The town had swollen in anticipation. Ranchers from the outer valley, prospectors from the hills, and curious families from neighboring settlements had descended upon Redford, filling the boarding house and the livery stable to capacity. The air was thick with dust and tension, a physical pressure that seemed to press against the buildings. The trial was to be held in the church, the only building large enough to accommodate the spectacle. It was a white clapboard structure with a steeple that leaned slightly to the west, as if tired of fighting the wind. Inside, the pews had been rearranged. The altar was converted into a judge's bench, draped in black cloth. The pulpit was the witness stand. On the morning the trial began, the heat was oppressive. The sky was a pale, blinding white, and the sun beat down on the roof of the church, turning the interior into a stifling box of stale air and sweat. Lila Cartwright was brought in through the side door. She was flanked by Deputy Sam Miller and another guard. She wore the blue calico dress Jake had given her, the high collar buttoned tight. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, revealing the pale curve of her neck. She kept her head down, but she could feel the eyes of the town on her. It was a physical sensation, like the prickling of heat before a storm. There were whispers, sharp, hissing sounds that cut through the shuffling of boots. "She looks too innocent," a woman in the front row murmured to her neighbor. "That is how they trick you. Murderess," a man whispered. Jake Harlow stood at the back of the church, his back pressed against the wall. He was in his dress uniform, his badge polished to a high shine, but he felt like an imposter. He watched Lila walk to the defendant's table, her steps small and measured. He saw the way her hands gripped the fabric of her skirt, the knuckles white. He wanted to go to her, to stand between her and the crowd, but he was bound by the invisible chains of the court. The prosecutor was a man named Elias Harris. He was a sharp-featured man from the capital, with slicked-back hair and a suit that looked too expensive for the frontier. He had been brought in by the Cartwright family's influence, a hired gun who fought with words instead of bullets. Judge Blackwood pounded his gavel, a harsh, cracking sound that silenced the room. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. The proceedings began with a terrifying formality. The charges were read: murder in the first degree, malice aforethought, the taking of a human life. Harris stood for his opening statement. He walked back and forth in front of the jury box. 12 men, mostly ranchers and merchants. Faces Jake knew well. Faces that owed money to the bank or feared Clayton Cartwright. "Gentlemen of the jury," Harris began, his voice smooth and carrying to the back of the room. "You see before you a tragedy, a young woman, barely out of girlhood, brought into a home of standing and respect. Thomas Cartwright was a pillar of this community, a man who built this valley, and how was he repaid for his kindness?" Harris paused, turning to point a long finger at Lila. "He was repaid with a bullet to the heart. This was not an accident. This was not a fit of passion. This was a calculation. A woman who tired of her husband, who wanted his land, his money, and his freedom. She is young, yes. She is beautiful, yes, but do not let that deceive you. The viper is often beautiful before it strikes." Jake felt his jaw tighten until his teeth ached. He watched Clayton Cartwright sitting in the front pew, his arms crossed, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. The defense attorney was a court-appointed man named Mr. Sterling. He was older, frayed around the cuffs, and looked as though he had given up on hope 10 years ago. But he was not incompetent. When it was time for the defense, Sterling called Lila to the stand. A ripple of sound went through the church as Lila stood up. She walked to the pulpit, her legs trembling so badly she had to hold the railing to keep from falling. She swore on the Bible, her voice a whisper that barely reached the first row. "Mrs. Cartwright," Sterling said gently, "tell the court about your marriage." Lila took a breath. She looked out at the sea of faces, the men who had drunk with her husband, the women who had ignored her bruises. She looked for Jake in the back. He met her gaze, his blue eyes steady and anchoring. Truth. His eyes seemed to say, just the truth. "My father owed Thomas money," Lila began, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. $400. We were losing the farm. Thomas came to the house. He looked at the land, and then he looked at me. He told my father he would forgive the debt if I went with him. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was not the story of a whirlwind romance the town had assumed. "And after you were married?" Sterling asked. "He changed," Lila said. "In town, he was smiling. He bought drinks. But when the door closed," she faltered. The memory of the cabin, the smell of whiskey, the sound of the belt snapping, it all rushed back, choking her. "Go on, Lila," Sterling urged softly. "He said I was useless," she whispered. "He said I cost too much to feed. The first time he hit me was over a burnt pie. He slapped me so hard I fell into the stove. I burned my arm." She pulled up the sleeve of her dress, revealing a patch of scarred, puckered skin on her forearm. The courtroom went quiet. "He hit me often," she continued, the words spilling out faster now. "If I spoke too loud, if I spoke too soft, if it rained, if the cattle were sick, it was always my fault." She spoke of the isolation, the days locked in the house, the time he held her head underwater in the horse trough until she passed out. She spoke of the baby she lost in the winter, the blood in the snow. As she spoke, the mood in the room shifted. The hunger for scandal was replaced by an uncomfortable, shifting silence. Men looked at their boots. Women frowned, perhaps recognizing the shadows of their own lives in her words. Clayton Cartwright did not look down. He stared at Lila with eyes like flint, whispering something to Harris. When Sterling finished, Harris stood up. He did not look gentle. He looked like a wolf who had smelled a wounded deer. "Mrs. Cartwright," Harris said, walking up to the pulpit, "you say your husband was a monster, yet you stayed. For 3 years, you stayed. Why?" "I was afraid," Lila said. "Afraid?" Harris scoffed. "You had a horse. The door was not locked. You could have ridden to town. You could have gone to the neighbors. But you didn't. Is it not true that you enjoyed the comfort of his money? The roof over your head?" "No," Lila said, her voice shaking. "I had nowhere to go. Or did you stay because you were waiting for the right moment?" Harris pressed, leaning in close. "You say he attacked you that night, but you are the one who reached the gun. You are the one who pulled the trigger. He was going to kill me," Lila cried out. "So you say," Harris countered. "But he is not here to defend himself, is he?" "We only have your word. The word of a woman who admits she hated her husband, a woman who stood to inherit everything upon his death." He twisted her words, turning her fear into calculation, her survival into greed. Lila felt herself shrinking, the small flame of her courage flickering out under his assault. She looked at Jake again, but Harris blocked her view. A wall of black wool and accusation. When Lila stepped down, she looked exhausted, as if she had run 10 miles. The prosecution called their witnesses, men who claimed Thomas was a saint, neighbors who said they never heard a scream. Then, it was time for the defense to call Sheriff Harlow. Jake walked to the stand, his boot heels loud on the wooden floor. He sat down, the chair creaking under his frame. He placed his hat on his knee. "Sheriff," Sterling said. "You were the first to see the defendant after the incident?" "I was," Jake said, his voice deep and clear. "And you visited the scene of the crime?" "I did. Tell the court what you found." Jake sat up straighter. "I found a cabin that had seen a fight. A violent fight. I found a heavy oak chair kicked over on its side. I found scuff marks on the floorboards that indicated a struggle for leverage. I found a dent in the plaster wall at shoulder height, consistent with a person being thrown against it. And the body? Thomas Cartwright was lying on his back, but the blood trail showed he had fallen forward first. On to the defendant. Did you observe any injuries on Mrs. Cartwright? Harris stood up. "Objection. The sheriff is not a doctor." Judge Blackwood waved a hand. "Overruled. The sheriff may state what he saw." Jake looked directly at the jury. "I saw bruises on her wrists, distinct finger marks. I saw a fresh bruise on her jaw. I saw a cut on her lip, and when she was processed, I saw older bruising on her neck and shoulders. Yellow and green marks, the kind that come from repeated trauma." He let the words hang in the hot air. Repeated trauma. "In my professional opinion," Jake said, his voice hard, "the evidence at the scene is entirely consistent with a struggle for the weapon in self-defense. It is not consistent with a premeditated murder." Sterling sat down, looking satisfied. Harris stood up slowly. "Sheriff Harlow," Harris said, smiling thinly, "you seem to have taken a great personal interest in this case." "I have an interest in justice," Jake replied coolly. "Of course. Tell me, Sheriff, is it true that you have provided the prisoner with meals from the hotel? That you bought her the dress she is wearing today? That you moved her from a cell to a private room in your own office?" Jake felt a flush of heat rise up his neck. It is standard procedure to protect a prisoner when there are threats against her life. "Threats? Or is it simply that you have a soft spot for a pretty face?" Harris asked, his voice dripping with insinuation. The crowd murmured. The implication was clear. The sheriff was thinking with his heart, not his head. "I did my duty," Jake said, his voice tight. "Did you?" Harris asked. "Or are you seeing what you want to see? You are a widower, are you not, Sheriff? A lonely man. Perhaps you see a damsel in distress where there is only a cold-blooded killer." "I see the facts," Jake snapped, his composure cracking. "And the facts say she was beaten." "No further questions," Harris said, turning his back on him dismissively. Jake stepped down, his blood boiling. He felt exposed, stripped naked in front of the town. He knew Harris had planted the seed of doubt. If the sheriff was in love with her, his testimony was tainted. And the terrifying part was, Harris was right. He was in love with her. During the recess, a bailiff approached Jake. "The judge wishes to see you in his chambers." Jake walked to the small vestry room at the back of the church. Judge Blackwood was sitting in a high-backed chair, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked tired and old. "Close the door." "Sheriff." Jake closed it. "Sheriff Harlow," Blackwood said, not looking up. "You are a good lawman. I have seen your record. You kept the peace in this valley when it was nothing but wolves and outlaws." "Thank you, Judge. But today," Blackwood said, looking up with sharp, gray eyes, "you walked a very fine line." "I told the truth," Jake said. "You told the truth," Blackwood corrected. "But Mr. Harris raised a valid point, however crudely he phrased it. Your impartiality is in question. My feelings do not change the evidence at the scene," Jake argued. "Perhaps not, but they change how that evidence is perceived." Blackwood sighed. "I am warning you, Jake, do not let your heart interfere with the law. If you cross that line, I cannot protect you. And more importantly, you will do that young woman no favors if the jury thinks she seduced the sheriff to save her neck." Jake stood stiffly. "I understand, Your Honor." "Do you?" Blackwood asked softly. "I wonder." That night, the jail was silent as a tomb. The trial was over. The closing arguments had been made. The jury would deliberate in the morning. Lila was back in the secure room behind the office. She was sitting on the cot, staring at her hands. She looked ghostly pale in the moonlight that filtered through the boarded window. Jake unlocked the door and stepped in. He carried a tray of food, but neither of them looked at it. He set the tray on the crate and sat on the edge of the desk chair, facing her. "You did well today," Jake said quietly. Lila shook her head. "They didn't believe me. I saw it in their faces. They looked at me like I was something dirty. Some of them listened." Jake said, "I saw the look on Mr. Miller's face and Mrs. Gable. They heard you." Lila looked up at him. Her eyes were swimming with unshed tears. You shouldn't have said those things, about the dress, about helping me. He made it sound like we were doing something wrong. He was trying to hurt me to get to you." Jake said, "It's a trick. I almost lied," Lila whispered. "When he asked if you were kind to me, I almost said no. I wanted to protect you. I don't want to drag you down with me." Jake felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He moved off the chair, kneeling on the floor so he was eye level with her. The distance between them was nothing. A few feet of air charged with the electricity of everything they hadn't said. "You could never drag me down, Lila," he said. Lila looked at him, her gaze traveling over his face, the scar on his chin, the tiredness in his eyes, the strength of his jaw. "I have been afraid for so long," she said, her voice trembling. "For 3 years. I have been afraid of every sound, every footstep, but when I am here, when you are near me, it is the only time I feel safe." The admission hung in the air, fragile and honest. Jake stopped breathing for a moment. He looked at her lips, then up to her eyes. The urge to touch her was a physical pain, a burning ache in his chest. He wanted to take her face in his hands and kiss the fear away. He wanted to promise her that he would kill anyone who tried to hurt her again. He raised his hand. His fingers brushed the air beside her cheek. Lila leaned into the ghost of the touch, her eyes closing. "Jake," she breathed. He froze. The badge on his chest caught the lamplight. The judge's warning echoed in his ears. Do not let your heart interfere. If he touched her now, if he crossed that line, he would be confirming everything Harris had said. He would be taking advantage of a prisoner, with a monumental effort of will. Jake lowered his hand. He rested it on the cot beside hers, his knuckles brushing against her skirt. "Lila," he said, his voice rough and low, "I am not going to let them take you. Do you hear me? I will fight until there is no fight left." Lila opened her eyes. She saw the restraint in him, and she understood it. It was a greater act of love than any kiss could have been. "I know," she whispered. They sat there in the silence, the air vibrating between them. Two people on the edge of a precipice, holding on only to each other. The next morning, the jury returned after only 2 hours. The church was packed again. The heat was even worse than the day before. The air smelled of sweat and old wood. Lila stood at the defendant's table. She felt lightheaded, as if her body were floating away. Jake stood at the back, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver, his knuckles white. Judge Blackwood turned to the jury foreman. "A cattleman named Silas Thorne, Mr. Foreman. Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," Thorne said. He did not look at Lila. "Read the verdict." Thorne unfolded a piece of paper. His hands were steady. "We find the defendant, Lila Cartwright, guilty of murder in the 2nd degree." A gasp went through the room. Lila felt her knees give way. She grabbed the table to stay upright. The world went gray at the edges. "However," Thorne continued, raising his voice over the murmur, "we recommend mercy, due to mitigating circumstances." Judge Blackwood nodded slowly. He looked at Lila. His face was unreadable, a mask of judicial stone. "Lila Cartwright, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. The recommendation for mercy is noted and will be forwarded to the territorial governor. However, the law prescribes a specific penalty for this crime." He picked up a pen and wrote something in the ledger. "It is the judgment of this court that you be taken from this place to the county prison, and there, in 30 days' time, you be hanged by the neck until dead. May God have mercy on your soul." The gavel banged down. It sounded like a gunshot. Lila did not scream. She did not cry. She simply swayed, like a tree cut at the roots. The defender, Mr. Sterling, caught her arm to steady her. Jake, at the back of the room, felt the words hit him like physical blows. Hanged by the neck. The room swam before his eyes. He had to look away, staring at the floor, fighting the urge to draw his gun and start shooting. He had to keep his composure. He had to be the sheriff. Across the aisle, Clayton Cartwright stood up. He smoothed his coat. He looked at Lila, and a thin, satisfied smile touched his lips. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was the smile of a man who had won a business transaction. He had protected his name. He had protected his property. "Sheriff," the judge called out, "remand the prisoner." Jake forced his legs to move. He walked down the aisle, the crowd parting for him. He approached Lila. She looked up at him, her eyes dead and empty. "Come on, Lila," he said softly. He did not put the cuffs on her. He took her arm, gently, and led her out of the church, past the staring eyes, past Clayton's smirk, and out into the blinding white sun. Back in the cell, the silence was different now. It wasn't the silence of waiting. It was the silence of the end. Lila sat on the cot. She was very still. She didn't cry. She seemed to have moved beyond tears into a place of cold, numb acceptance. Jake stood by the door. He felt like he was bleeding internally. "I knew," Lila said softly. Her voice was flat. "I knew this would happen. Women like me, we don't get saved. Jake, we don't get happy endings." "Don't say that," Jake said fiercely. "This isn't over. The governor is a friend of the Cartwrights." Lila said, "You know that." She looked at him. There was no accusation in her eyes, only a terrible, crushing sadness. "Thank you for trying. Jake, you were the only one who ever tried." Jake turned away. He couldn't bear the resignation in her voice. He walked into his office and closed the door. He stood in the center of the room. The sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across the floor. He looked at his desk. His badge sat there, gleaming in the dying light. Beside it lay his revolver. He looked at the badge. It represented 20 years of his life. It represented honor, order, the law. It was who he was. But the law had just sentenced an innocent woman to death. The law had bowed to money and power. The law was broken. Jake reached out and picked up the revolver. He checked the cylinder. It was full. He looked at the badge one last time. He felt something inside him harden. It was a cold, iron resolve. He realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that he didn't care about the law anymore. He cared about her. If the law was going to kill her, then he would have to stand against the law. He holstered the gun. He did not pin the badge back on his chest. He left it sitting on the desk. He walked to the window and looked out at the darkening street. The town was celebrating. He could hear laughter from the saloon. Let them laugh, Jake thought grimly. Let them think it's over. He turned back toward the door that led to Lila's room. He had 30 days, but he wouldn't need 30 days. He needed a plan, and he needed to be willing to lose everything. He walked to the door, his hand resting on the latch. He was ready. The rumors started as whispers in the alleyways of Redford, carried on the dusty wind like dry leaves. They were not spoken openly in the saloon or the general store, but they were there, lurking in the shadows where men traded secrets for coin. Jake Harlow first heard the true shape of the danger from Raina. The midwife found him late one evening as he was checking the cinches on his saddle outside the livery stable. She did not approach him directly, but stood near the water trough, waiting until he looked up. "They are moving her," Raina said, her voice low and devoid of inflection. "I know," Jake replied, not stopping his work. "The order came down this morning. Transfer to the territorial prison in Santa Fe. That is the paper story," Raina said. She stepped closer, looking around to ensure the street was empty. "But the story in the dark is different. I heard men talking near the creek, men who work for Clayton." Jake stopped. He rested his hand on the saddle horn and looked at her. "What did they say?" "They said the road to Santa Fe is long and dangerous. Raina said. They said accidents happen in the canyons. They said it would be a shame if the prisoner tried to escape and had to be put down. A cold knot tightened in Jake's stomach. He had suspected it, but hearing it spoken aloud gave the threat a terrifying weight. "Thank you." "Raina," Jake said. He left the horse and walked straight to the hotel where Judge Blackwood was staying. The judge was in the parlor, drinking brandy and reading a newspaper from the Capitol. He looked up, annoyed, as Jake marched in, dust trailing from his boots. "Judge, we need to talk about the transfer," Jake said without preamble. "Sheriff Harlow?" Blackwood sighed, folding his paper. "It is late. Surely this can wait until morning." "It cannot wait," Jake said. He stood over the judge's chair, his presence looming and intense. "I have reason to believe there is a plot to kill Mrs. Cartwright during the transport?" Blackwood blinked, his expression shifting from annoyance to a guarded wariness. "That is a serious accusation. Sheriff, do you have proof?" "I have word from sources I trust." Jake said, "Clayton Cartwright does not intend for her to reach the prison. He wants her dead, and he wants it done before she can speak to a governor or an appeal board." Blackwood took a sip of his brandy. His hand trembled slightly. "Sheriff, the paperwork is signed. The escort has been arranged. 2 deputies from the county seat are arriving in the morning to assist you. Those men are likely bought and paid for." Jake snapped. "Delay the transfer. Keep her here until I can get federal marshals." "I cannot do that," Blackwood said, his voice rising. "The town is a powder keg. If I keep her here, there will be a riot. The law says she must be moved. You will carry out your orders." "Sheriff, if she dies on the road, it is on your hands," Jake said, his voice dangerously quiet. Blackwood looked away, unable to meet the sheriff's gaze. "It is out of my hands. Jake, do your duty." Jake walked out of the hotel, the taste of bile in his throat. The law was not just broken. It was rotting from the inside out. He stood on the boardwalk, looking down the dark street toward the jail. He was alone. He went to the office and unlocked the door to the back room. Lila was awake, sitting on the edge of the cot. She looked up as he entered, her eyes large and luminous in the dim light. She saw the look on his face immediately. "What is it?" she asked. Jake pulled the chair over and sat down, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. He looked at her, memorizing the curve of her face, the way the shadows fell across her cheekbone. "They are moving you tomorrow morning," he said. Lila nodded. "To the prison." "I know." "No," Jake said. "That is what they say, but I don't think you are meant to get there." Lila went very still. She didn't gasp or cry out. She just stared at him with a resigned, weary acceptance that broke his heart. She was 20 years old, and she was already used to men deciding when and how she would die. "They are going to kill me on the road?" she asked softly. "They are going to try," Jake said. "They will claim you tried to escape. It's a clean way to tie up loose ends." Lila looked down at her hands. "I am tired. Jake, I am so tired of being afraid. Maybe it is better this way." "No," Jake said fiercely. He reached out and took her hands in his. Her skin was cool, her fingers slender against his calloused palms. "No, you listen to me. I am not going to let that happen." "What can you do?" Lila asked, looking at their joined hands. "You are one man against the whole town. I am the man who is going to be in that wagon with you," Jake said. "And I am going to ask you something, Lila, and I need you to answer me honestly." She looked up, meeting his blue eyes. "If I give you a chance to run," Jake asked, his voice rough, "will you take it?" Lila hesitated. She looked at him, searching his face. "If I run, what happens to you? You will lose your job. You will be a criminal. You will lose everything you have built." "I don't care about any of that," Jake said. "I only care about you. Will you run?" Lila squeezed his hands. "I don't want to die, Jake, but I don't want to destroy your life to save mine. My life is worth nothing if I watch them kill you," Jake said. The intensity of his words hung in the small room. It was a declaration, stripped of poetry but heavy with truth. "Okay," Lila whispered. "Okay." The morning dawned pale and cloudless. The sky a hard, enameled blue that promised heat. The air was dry, smelling of sage and dust. A buckboard wagon stood in front of the sheriff's office. 2 horses, sturdy bays, were hitched to it. Deputy Sam Miller was checking the harness. He looked nervous, his eyes darting up and down the street. Standing near the wagon were 2 men Jake did not know. They were hard-faced men, wearing dusters and low-slung gun belts. They introduced themselves as Cobb and Slater, deputies from the county. Jake noted the way Slater's eyes moved constantly, scanning the rooftops, and the way Cobb kept his hand near his hip. "Bring the prisoner out," Cobb said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "We are burning daylight." Jake went inside. Lila was standing by the desk. She wore the blue dress, now dusted with the grime of the jail. "Turn around," Jake said softly. He placed the shackles on her wrists. He made a show of locking them tight, but he had filed the pin on the locking mechanism the night before. It would hold, but a sharp blow or a strong twist would spring it. "I am sorry," he whispered. "Do what you have to do," Lila said. He led her out into the bright morning light. A few early risers stopped to watch. There were no shouts today, only a heavy, sullen silence. Jake helped Lila into the back of the wagon. He sat beside her. Cobb took the reins, and Slater mounted a horse to ride alongside. Sam rode on the other side, looking pale. The wagon lurched forward, the wheels grinding in the dirt. They rolled down the main street, past the saloon, past the church where she had been condemned, and out onto the open prairie. The journey was tense. The only sounds were the creak of the wood, the jingle of the harness, and the steady rhythm of hooves. The land opened up around them, vast and indifferent. To the west, the red rock canyons rose like jagged teeth against the sky. Jake watched Cobb's back. He watched Slater riding point. He saw them exchange glances, small nods, subtle shifts in posture. They rode for 2 hours until the town was just a smudge on the horizon. The road dipped into a dry wash, a narrow canyon with high walls of sandstone that blocked out the sun. The shadows were deep here, and the air was cooler. "This is it," Jake thought. He shifted his position on the bench, sliding his hand toward the knife he kept in his boot. Cobb slowed the wagon. "Whoa, there," he muttered, pulling on the reins. "What's the trouble?" Sam asked. "Riding up. Wheel feels loose," Cobb said. "Better check it." It was the signal. From the ridge above, a gunshot cracked. The sound echoed off the canyon walls like a thunderclap. A bullet struck the wood of the wagon inches from Jake's head, sending splinters flying. "Ambush!" Slater yelled, but his voice lacked surprise. He spurred his horse, riding toward a cluster of rocks, supposedly for cover. But he didn't draw his gun. Jake moved. He didn't reach for his revolver. He grabbed the chain of Lila's shackles. He pulled a heavy iron key from his pocket, not the real key, but a tool he had prepared, and jammed it into the mechanism, twisting violently. The lock sprang open. "Get down!" Jake roared, shoving Lila to the floorboards of the wagon. Gunfire erupted from the rim of the canyon. 4 or 5 men were up there, hidden in the rocks. Bullets kicked up spurts of dust around the wagon and whined off the iron wheel rims. Sam Miller, confused but reacting with the instinct of a trained deputy, drew his gun and fired back at the ridge. "They're pinning us down!" Sam shouted. Jake drew his Colt. He reached under the wagon seat and pulled out a second revolver, a spare he had stashed there. He shoved it into Lila's hand. "Do you know how to use this?" Jake yelled over the noise. "I know." Lila shouted back. She was pale, shaking, but her eyes were fierce. Jake looked at Cobb. The driver had jumped down and was crouching behind the horses, but he wasn't firing. He was waiting. Jake realized with a sick certainty that the men on the ridge weren't trying to hit Cobb or Slater. They were aiming for the wagon bed. "Watch the ridge," Jake shouted to Lila. "Keep your head down." He leaned over the side of the wagon and fired 3 shots in rapid succession, forcing a rifleman on the cliffs to duck. Lila scrambled to her knees, using the wooden side of the wagon for cover. She saw a movement to her left, a rider coming down a narrow goat path, trying to flank them. She lifted the heavy pistol. Her hands trembled, but she locked her elbows. She remembered the weight of the gun in the cabin. She remembered the explosion. She squeezed the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand. The shot went wide, but it was close enough to spook the horse. The rider fought to control his mount. Cursing, Lila fired again. This time, the rider jerked, clutching his arm, and turned his horse back up the trail. "I got him!" Lila screamed, a strange, wild exhilaration mixing with her terror. But the real danger was closer. Slater, the man on the horse who had taken cover, suddenly turned. He wasn't looking at the ridge. He was looking at Jake. Jake was reloading, his attention on the cliffs. He didn't see Slater raise his pistol, but Lila did. Time seemed to slow down into a thick, syrupy crawl. She saw the sun glint on the barrel of Slater's gun. She saw his finger tighten on the trigger. He was 10 feet away. He couldn't miss. "Jake!" she screamed. She didn't think. She didn't calculate. She threw herself across the wagon bed, launching her body toward Jake. She hit him just as Slater fired. The impact knocked Jake sideways. The bullet, meant for the center of his chest, tore through the fabric of his coat and plowed a furrow across the top of his shoulder. Jake yelled in pain, a sharp, guttural sound. He fell back against the wagon seat. The wind knocked out of him. Lila scrambled over him, shielding his body with hers. She pointed her gun at Slater. Slater's eyes went wide. He hadn't expected the girl to fight. He hadn't expected her to be free. Before Slater could cock his hammer again, Sam Miller saw what was happening. "Traitor!" Sam shouted. Sam fired. His bullet hit Slater in the chest. The hired man flew backward out of his saddle, hitting the dust with a heavy thud. On the ridge, the attackers saw their plan falling apart. Their inside man was down. The sheriff was returning fire. The element of surprise was gone. "Pull back!" a voice shouted from the rocks. The gunfire stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The sound of hoofbeats retreated, fading into the distance. Silence descended on the canyon. It was a heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the snorting of the horses and the harsh, ragged breathing of the survivors. Cobb, the driver, stood up from behind the horses. He looked at Slater's body, then at Jake and Sam. His hand hovered near his gun. "Don't!" Jake rasped. Jake was sitting up, clutching his shoulder. Blood was seeping through his fingers, dark and wet. He had his gun trained on Cobb. Cobb slowly raised his hands. "I didn't know. Sheriff, I swear, I was just driving the wagon." "Get on your horse," Jake said, his voice tight with pain. "And ride. If I see you again, I will kill you." Cobb didn't argue. He unhitched one of the wagon horses, scrambled onto its bare back, and galloped back the way they had come. Sam rode up to the wagon. He looked shaken. His face was gray. "Sheriff?" Sam asked. "You hit bad?" Jake looked at his shoulder. It was a mess of torn cloth and blood, but the bone felt intact. "Just a graze," he grunted. Deep, though. Lila was on her knees beside him. She had torn a strip from her petticoat and was pressing it against the wound. Her hands were slick with his blood. "Hold still," she commanded, her voice trembling but firm. "You're bleeding too much." Jake looked at her. Her face was streaked with dust and gunpowder. Her hair had come loose from its bun and was hanging wild around her shoulders. She looked fierce. She looked beautiful. "You saved my life," Jake whispered. "You saved mine first," Lila said. She pressed harder on the wound, and he winced. Sam looked down at Slater's body. "What do we do now, Jake? We can't go back to town. They'll just try again. Or they'll hang her for escaping." Jake looked around the desolate canyon. He looked at the red rocks, the endless sky. He realized there was no going back. The badge he had left on his desk was a symbol of a life that was over. "We are dead," Jake said. Sam blinked. "What? Go back to town?" "Sam," Jake said. "Tell them the ambush succeeded. Tell them the men on the ridge killed us both and took the bodies. Tell them Slater died defending us." Sam stared at him. "You want me to lie?" "It's the only way," Jake said. "If they think we're dead, they stop hunting us. It buys us time." "Time for what?" Sam asked. "Time to find proof. Jake said. Time to find the ledgers Raina talked about. Time to burn Clayton Cartwright's kingdom to the ground. Sam looked at Lila, then at Jake. He took a deep breath and nodded. He reached out and holstered his gun. You were dead when I left you, Sam said solemnly. Godspeed, Jake. He reached out. Jake took his hand with his good arm. The grip was firm, a farewell between men who respected each other. Sam turned his horse and rode back toward Redford, leaving them alone in the vastness of the territory. Jake looked at Lila. Can you ride? He asked. I can ride, she said. They unhitched the remaining wagon horse. Jake mounted his own horse, Rusty, which had been tied to the back of the wagon. Lila took the wagon horse. They turned west, away from the road, away from the law, and rode into the wild country. They rode until the sun began to dip below the peaks of the distant mountains. The land became rougher, a maze of dry riverbeds and rocky foothills dotted with scrub pine and juniper. It was a hard, unforgiving landscape, beautiful in its indifference. Jake's shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm. Every step the horse took sent a jolt of pain through his body. He gritted his teeth, refusing to stop until they found good cover. They found a ravine sheltered by a stand of twisted cottonwoods. A small trickle of water ran through the bottom. Enough for the horses. We camp here, Jake said, his voice tight. He dismounted heavily, stumbling as his feet hit the ground. Lila was there instantly, her arm around his waist to steady him. Sit down, she said. Let me look at it properly. Jake sat on a flat rock. Lila gathered wood and started a small fire. She used the water from the creek to clean the wound. It was an ugly gash, tearing through the muscle, but the bullet had passed clean through the flesh without shattering the bone. It needs stitches, Lila said, examining it in the fading light. But we don't have a needle. I'll have to bind it tight. She tore more strips from her petticoat. She worked with a focused intensity, her brow furrowed. Jake watched her. He felt the sting of the water, the pressure of her hands. But beneath the pain, he felt something else. He felt the intimacy of it. For months, there had been bars between them. There had been laws and roles, sheriff and prisoner, man and accused. Now, there was nothing, just flesh and blood and the vast, empty night. Lila finished binding the wound. She sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her skirt. Thank you, Jake said. Lila looked up at him. The firelight danced in her eyes. You took the shackles off, she said softly. You gave me a gun. I trusted you. Jake said, you could have died. I would rather die than see you in a cage again. The words hung in the air, stripping away the last of their defenses. Lila moved closer. She reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I was so scared, she whispered. When I saw him aim at you, I thought I lost you, and I realized. She stopped, her voice catching. What did you realize? Jake asked. I realized I don't want to be safe if you aren't there, she said. Jake reached out with his good arm and pulled her close. She came willingly, burying her face in his neck. He could feel her trembling. He breathed in the scent of her, dust and sage and woman. It was cold in the ravine. The temperature dropped rapidly as the sun vanished. They had one blanket, the worn wool roll from behind Jake's saddle. We need to sleep, Jake said. We have a long ride tomorrow. He spread the blanket on the ground near the fire. Lila lay down, curling onto her side. Jake lay down behind her, careful of his shoulder. At first, they lay stiffly, a few inches of cold air between them, but the wind picked up, moaning through the ravine, cutting through their clothes. Come here, Jake murmured. Lila shifted backward, pressing her body against his. Jake wrapped his good arm around her, pulling her tight against his chest. The contact was electric. They fit together as if they had been carved for this moment. Jake rested his chin on the top of her head. He could feel the beat of her heart against his arm. Lila turned in his embrace so she was facing him. Her face was inches from his. In the starlight, he could see every detail, the dark lashes, the small scar on her lip, the depth of her eyes. "Jake," she whispered. "What happens now?" "We survive," Jake said. "We find the proof. We go back." "And if we don't?" she asked. "If we die out here, then we die free," Jake said. "And we die together." Lila looked at him, her eyes searching his. "I don't know if I can be brave enough." "You are the bravest person I know," Jake said. He meant it. He saw the woman who had endured 3 years of hell, who had stood up in court, who had thrown herself in front of a bullet. Lila let out a shuddering breath. "I don't regret it," she said. "Killing Thomas, I don't regret it, and I don't regret running with you." Jake looked at her lips. The desire that had been simmering for weeks, held back by iron bars and moral codes, suddenly flared up, hot and undeniable. "I don't regret choosing you," he said. "I would do it 1,000 times." He leaned in. Lila lifted her head to meet him. Their lips touched. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of fear and dust and blood. It was a collision of two broken people who had found the only thing that made sense in a world gone mad. Lila's hands clutched at his coat, pulling him closer. Jake groaned low in his throat, his hand tangling in her hair. They kissed as if they were trying to breathe life into each other, as if this contact was the only thing anchoring them to the earth, when they finally broke apart, breathless and dizzy. They stayed close, foreheads resting together. "I love you," Lila whispered. It was a terrified confession. "I love you," Jake answered. They didn't move further. The exhaustion of the day, the pain of the wound, and the sheer emotional weight of the moment held them in a suspended state of grace. They lay there, wrapped around each other, limbs tangled, holding on as the fire burned down to embers. The wind howled through the ravine, a lonely, desolate sound, but under the rough wool blanket, for the first time in years, neither of them felt alone. They fell asleep in each other's arms, fugitives in the wilderness, bound by a love that was as dangerous and necessary as the air they breathed. The land did not care about their names or their crimes. It was a vast, indifferent ocean of sagebrush and sandstone, stretching out under a sky that seemed too big for the earth beneath it, for 7 days. Lila and Jake were nothing but two specks moving across this enormity, stripped down to the raw essentials of survival. They traveled mostly by night to avoid the glint of sun on metal that might betray them to a watcher on a high ridge. They picked their way through dry riverbeds, where the stones clattered like bones under the horses' hooves. They rode across high, wind-scoured flats where the dust tasted of ancient salt. Hunger became a constant companion, a dull ache in the belly that sharpened the senses. Thirst was a sharper pain, alleviated only by muddy water from hidden springs Jake remembered from his days hunting outlaws in the deep territory. But in the crucible of this hardship, the bond between them hardened into something unbreakable. They spoke little while they rode, saving their breath for the trail. But in the quiet moments of camp, a new language developed between them. It was a language of small gestures. It was the way Jake handed her the canteen, his fingers lingering for a second on hers. It was the way Lila checked the bandage on his shoulder every evening, her touch gentle and sure, her eyes scanning his face for signs of fever. Jake's wound was healing, knitting together into a puckered red scar, but it stiffened in the cold mountain air. One afternoon, as they climbed a steep, shale-covered trail that crumbled underfoot, Jake stumbled. Lila was there instantly, her hand pressing firmly against the small of his back, steadying him. "Lean on me," she said, her voice wind-roughened but steady. "I am too heavy for you," Jake grunted, though he did not pull away. "You carried me when I was in a cage." Lila said, "I can carry you up a hill." They looked at each other then, breathing hard in the thin air. Jake saw the dirt smudged on her cheek, the way her hair had escaped its pins to hang wild around her shoulders. He saw a strength in her that awestruck him. She was no longer the trembling girl in the kitchen. She was a partner. "We are almost to the pass," Jake said softly, "and then it is down into the timber." They made camp that night beneath a limestone cliff that held the heat of the day long after the sun had set. They had shot a rabbit and roasted it over a small, smokeless fire. The meat was tough, but to them, it tasted like a feast. After they ate, the silence of the wilderness settled around them. The stars were coming out, thousands of them, crowding the darkness with a brilliance that made the head spin. Lila sat with her knees drawn up, staring into the dying embers. "Jake," she said quietly, "I am here. Do you think God forgives us?" Jake looked at her. "For killing Thomas?" "For that," Lila said, "and for feeling glad that he is gone." She turned to him, her eyes dark with guilt. "I feel a lightness, Jake. Every morning when I wake up and I don't have to listen for his boots, I feel like I am floating. But then I remember that I put a bullet in his heart. Is it wicked to feel free because someone else is dead?" Jake moved closer to her on the hard ground. He reached out and took her hand. His palms were rough, calloused by years of rope and rain, but his touch was tender. "Lila," he said, his voice low and rumbled like the earth itself. "You were in a trap. A wolf that chews its leg off to get out of a trap feels pain. Yes, but mostly it feels relief that it can run again. That is not wickedness. That is life wanting to live." He squeezed her hand. "Thomas built his own end, brick by brick. Every time he raised a hand to you, you just closed the door on it." Lila looked down at their joined hands. A tear slipped down her nose and fell onto his wrist. "I never thought I would be happy," she whispered. "I thought my life was over the day my father sold me. But out here, with you, I feel like I am finally starting." Jake felt his heart constrict with a fierce, overwhelming emotion. He looked at the woman beside him, a fugitive, a widow, a killer in the eyes of the law, and he knew he would burn the world down to keep her safe. "Lila," he said. She looked up. The firelight caught the gold in her eyes. He didn't need to ask. He saw the answer in the way she leaned toward him, the way her breath hitched. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands. Her skin was cool, dusty, and perfect. He lowered his head and kissed her. It started gentle, a question asked and answered. But then the dam broke. Years of loneliness, of duty, of cold nights and empty rooms crashed into the sudden, blinding heat of being wanted. Lila made a small sound in her throat and wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down. They kissed with a desperate, starving intensity. It was a kiss that tasted of sage and smoke and survival. It was a claiming. They moved together on the bedroll, the fire crackling beside them. There were no words needed now. The intimacy that followed was not just a physical act. It was a profound unraveling of defenses. For the first time in her life, Lila was not being taken. She was giving, and she was being received with a reverence that made her want to weep. For the first time in years, Jake was not a protector or a soldier. He was a man, vulnerable and open. They lay together under the vast, uncaring sky, skin against skin, heart against heart. The wind moaned through the canyons, but in the shelter of the cliff, there was only the sound of their breathing and the quiet, stubborn miracle of their love. Morning came with a frost that coated the sagebrush in silver. Lila woke wrapped in Jake's heavy coat, warm despite the chill. She watched the sun rise over the distant peaks, painting the snow in shades of pink and violent gold. Jake stirred beside her. He pushed himself up on one elbow, wincing slightly as his shoulder pulled. He looked at her silhouette against the sunrise. He realized then that he didn't just want to save her. He wanted to wake up beside her every morning for the rest of his life. He wanted to build a porch where they could watch the sun go down. He wanted to hear her laugh when she wasn't afraid. The thought terrified him. Hope was a dangerous thing to carry when you were a hunted man. "We have to move," Jake said, his voice rough with sleep. "The line shack is a half-day ride from here." They saddled the horses in the crisp air. The intimacy of the night before had not vanished. It had settled into a comfortable, solid weight between them. The journey to the line shack was brutal. They had to cross a river that ran white and fast with snowmelt. The water was numbing, cutting like knives against the horses' legs. Then came the forest, a dark, brooding stand of ponderosa pine where the wind sounded like voices whispering in the branches. The shack sat in a small clearing at the base of a rocky slope. It was a weather-beaten structure of gray logs, the roof sagging under the weight of years. It looked abandoned, a ghost of a building. Jake dismounted and drew his gun. "Stay with the horses," he signaled. He checked the perimeter. No tracks, no sign of life. He pushed the door open. It creaked on rusted hinges. "It's clear," he called out. Lila came inside. The shack smelled of rats and old damp wood. There was a rusted stove, a broken bunk, and a few crates scattered in the corner. "Where is it?" Lila asked, looking around doubtfully. Jake walked to the corner where the stove stood. Thomas was a creature of habit, he said. He liked to keep his secrets where he could warm his feet on them. He knelt down and pried at a loose floorboard beneath the stove. It came up with a groan of protesting nails. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a heavy book. Jake lifted it out. He unwrapped the cloth and opened the leather cover. It was a ledger. Lila crowded close, looking over his shoulder. The pages were filled with columns of numbers and names. Jake ran his finger down the list. "Here," he said, his voice hard. "Look, Mayor Higgins, $50. Prosecutor Harris, $100. Land deed transfer, Miller Farm, voided." It was all there. The bribery, the extortion, the systematic theft of land from struggling neighbors. "And here," Jake said, pointing to a recent entry. "Widow Cartwright conviction. Consolidate South Pasture." Lila stared at the words. Her breath caught in her throat. They were planning it. She whispered, "Even before the trial. They knew they would get the land if they hanged me." "It wasn't just about Thomas," Jake said, his anger burning cold and bright. "It was business. They used your pain to build their empire." Lila felt a wave of nausea, followed by a surge of pure, white-hot fury. Her suffering had been a line item in a ledger. Her life had been a transaction. "We have them," Jake said, closing the book. "This is proof. This brings down Clayton, the mayor, Harris, all of them." Before Lila could answer, a sound cut through the air outside, the sharp whinny of a horse. Jake spun around, blowing out the lantern. "Get down!" He tackled Lila, rolling them both behind the heavy crates in the corner just as the windows shattered inward. Gunfire erupted from the tree line. Bullets slammed into the log walls, punching through the chinking and sending splinters flying like shrapnel. "They found us!" Lila shouted, covering her head. Jake crawled to a knothole in the wall. He peered out. 6 men, he counted, maybe 7. "They are spreading out." He looked at Lila. He handed her the spare revolver. "Are you ready to fight?" he asked. Lila gripped the gun. Her hands were steady. "I am done running, Jake." Jake smashed the glass of the remaining window pane with the butt of his gun. He leaned out and fired 2 shots. A man screaming in the brush told him his aim was true. "Cover the door," Jake yelled. The attackers were bold. They rushed the shack, thinking they had the advantage of numbers, but they didn't know who was inside. Lila saw the door handle turn. She didn't wait. She fired through the wood. A yelp of pain, and footsteps retreating. They kept up a steady rhythm of fire, the shack filled with smoke and the deafening roar of the Colts. Jake moved from window to window, a ghost in the smoke, picking his targets with terrifying precision. Lila wasn't just loading for him this time. She was fighting. She saw a man trying to circle around to the blind side of the shack. She took a breath, aimed, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet kicked up dirt at his feet, and he scrambled back. Her second shot grazed his thigh. "They're pulling back!" Jake shouted. The attackers, realizing they had walked into a hornet's nest instead of a trap, retreated to the tree line. They mounted up and rode off, leaving one of their own groaning in the grass. Jake didn't chase them. He slumped against the wall, reloading his gun with shaking hands. His shoulder was bleeding again. Lila crawled over to him. "We can't stay here," she said. "They will bring more men. They will burn us out." "I know," Jake said. He looked at the ledger lying on the floor. "We can't hide in the hills forever." "Lila," he said, "we are ghosts out here. If we want to live, really live, we have to go back. Back to Redford? Lila asked. Back to the source. Jake said, we take this book, we take these letters, and we shove them down their throats in the middle of their own town. Lila looked at the ledger. She looked at the gun in her hand. She thought about the ocean she wanted to see. Let's go, she said. Let's finish it. They rode into Redford at high noon. 2 days later, they looked like apparitions rising from the grave. Their clothes were torn and stiff with dust. Jake's coat was stained with dried blood. Lila's hair was a tangled mane, her face sun-browned and fierce. They rode straight down the center of the main street. The town went silent. The blacksmith dropped his hammer. The piano in the saloon stopped. People poured out of the stores, staring with open mouths. It's them, someone whispered. The dead return. Jake didn't stop. He rode straight to the church, where he knew Judge Blackwood was still holding court for minor grievances before leaving town. He dismounted and helped Lila down. She held the ledger against her chest like a shield. They walked up the steps of the church. Jake kicked the doors open. The courtroom was half full. Judge Blackwood was on the bench. Clayton Cartwright was sitting in the front row. Looking bored. Prosecutor Harris was shuffling papers. They all froze as Jake and Lila marched down the aisle. Sheriff, Blackwood stammered, his face draining of color. You are dead. The report said, the report was a lie. Jake's voice boomed, echoing off the rafters. Just like everything else in this town. Clayton stood up slowly. His eyes narrowed. You should have stayed dead. Harlow. Jake ignored him. He turned to the crowd that was pressing in through the open doors. I have evidence, Jake shouted. Hard evidence of extortion, bribery, and conspiracy to commit murder. He pointed to Lila. She stepped forward and slammed the ledger onto the judge's bench. Read it, she cried out, her voice ringing clear and strong. Read what my husband and his brother did to this town. Blackwood looked at the book. He opened it. His eyes went wide. This is Thomas Cartwright's handwriting. He murmured. He began to read. He read the names of the farmers who had been bullied into selling. He read the amounts paid to the mayor. He read the payoff to Harris to ensure a guilty verdict. Murmurs of shock rippled through the room. Men looked at Clayton, their expressions shifting from fear to anger. Lies, Clayton roared. He stepped out into the aisle. It is a forgery. She wrote it herself. I can vouch for that writing. A voice came from the back. It was Mrs. Hensley. She stood up, her hands trembling but her chin high. And I can vouch that Thomas kept such a book. I saw it once when I came to pay my husband's debt. And I saw the bruises. Raina, the midwife, shouted from the doorway. I saw the baby he killed. Suddenly, the dam broke. A cowboy stood up. I was there when Clayton paid the men to ambush the wagon. I heard him give the order. The town turned. The fear that had held them silent for years evaporated in the face of the truth. Arrest him, someone shouted. Harris, the prosecutor, saw the tide turning. He grabbed his briefcase and bolted for the side door. Stop him, Jake yelled. 2 townsmen grabbed Harris before he could reach the exit. Clayton Cartwright stood alone in the center of the aisle. He looked at the town he thought he owned, and he saw only enemies. He looked at Jake, and he saw his death. You think you can take me? Harlow? Clayton snarled. You are nothing but a traitor with a badge. I am not a sheriff today, Jake said quietly. He reached up and unpinned the star from his chest. He tossed it onto the floor. It skidded across the wood and stopped at Clayton's feet. I am just a man, Jake said. Clayton's hand moved. It was a blur of motion. Clayton drew the pearl-handled revolver from his hip. But Jake had been a soldier before he was a sheriff. He didn't draw with a flourish. He drew with economy. 2 shots rang out, so close together they sounded like one long crack of thunder. Jake jerked back, clutching his side. A line of red appeared on his ribs. Clayton Cartwright stood still for a second. He looked surprised. He looked down at the dark hole in the center of his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He fell forward, hitting the floor with a heavy, final thud. The dust rose up around him. Silence filled the church. Jake stood swaying, his gun smoking in his hand. Lila ran to him. "Jake! I'm all right," he wheezed. "Just a scratch." He missed the important parts. Judge Blackwood stood up. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the dead man on the floor. He looked at the angry town. "Order!" he shouted, banging his gavel. "Order!" He looked down at Lila. "In light of this new evidence, and the clear corruption of the prosecution, the verdict against Lila Cartwright is vacated. She is innocent of murder. The killing of Thomas Cartwright was an act of self-defense. Case dismissed." A cheer went up from the crowd. A wild, cathartic sound. Lila stood in the center of the noise, but she felt strangely hollow. She looked at the faces cheering for her, the same faces that had wanted to hang her a week ago. She felt Jake's hand on her arm. "It's over," he said. Lila nodded. "It's over." Jake looked at the judge. He pointed to the badge on the floor. "Keep it," Jake said. "I'm done." They left 2 days later. Jake's wound was stitched and bandaged properly this time. They packed a small wagon with supplies. Lila had sold the remaining cattle from the Cartwright Ranch, her legal property now, and used the money to buy flour, coffee, and seeds. A man named Mr. Abernathy, the banker who had been blackmailed by Clayton, gave them a loan with no interest, his eyes wet with gratitude. The sun was setting as they rolled out of Redford. The town looked the same as it always had, dusty, small, fragile against the plains. But the shadow that had hung over it was gone. They stopped at the edge of the ridge. Lila looked back at the church steeple. She looked at the jailhouse where she'd spent her darkest nights. "Are you sad to leave?" Jake asked, taking the reins. Lila shook her head. "No, I am leaving my ghosts behind." She slipped her hand into his, their fingers interlaced. A perfect fit. "I am still afraid." "Jake," she confessed softly, "I don't know where we are going. I don't know what comes next." Jake looked at the horizon, where the mountains shimmered in the twilight. "We will carry the darkness with us. Lila," he said, "we can't pretend it didn't happen, but we will carry it together, and that makes it lighter." He clicked his tongue to the horses. "Giddy up!" The wagon rolled forward, the wheels crunching on the gravel. They rode away from the town, away from the graves, and into the vast, open country of the West. They made camp that night by a small river in a sheltered valley where the grass was knee-high and green. It was a good place, a place where a man could build a house, a place where a woman could plant a garden. Jake built a fire. The flames crackled, sending sparks up into the indigo sky. Lila sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. Jake wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. They watched the stars come out, one by one. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. They had scars on their skin and in their souls. They had nightmares that would wake them up sweating. But as the river sang its quiet song in the darkness, they knew they had something that most people searched for their whole lives and never found. They had chosen each other. And in the harsh, beautiful, unforgiving Wild West. That was enough. Thank you so much for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the dust and shadows of the American frontier. And I hope Lila and Jake's story resonated with you. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on the story in English. Did the ending surprise you? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of survival, love, and justice on the open range. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.